I'm so excited that you want to share the gospel with your friends, with your family, with just about every single person that you know. And right now, what I want to do is I want to share with you just a very simple way that I have used that has worked. I think the first thing that you need to realize is that you always got to have a conversation starter. See, when it comes to strangers, the best way that I've gone about it is I always try to do it with pairs. It's always essential to do it with another person. That way, you're not alone, and if anything happens, you always have somebody else right next to you. But what I do is that when I've done it with strangers, is I'll go around the neighborhood, my neighborhood, and I've knocked on doors and asked if they want prayer. And prayer is a simple way that people are willing to accept and receive. Now, sometimes people will say no thanks, but then I'll ask them, do you know someone, maybe a neighbor or someone that needs prayer, and maybe we can pray for them right now? And then typically they'll say yes to that. So that's with strangers or with neighbors, with family members, and so on and so forth. You can always do that. But once you pray, once you kind of like have broken that ice, you want to let them know why it is that you're doing this, right? And so the why is so important. And here's what I do. I'll start the conversation. I'll say, hey, I just want to let you know that the reason why I'm doing this is because, and here's key, there was a time in my life in which I used to feel lost and abandoned. But then I met Christ and I began to follow him. And now I've realized that my life has purpose and value. Do you have a story like that? And you see, what I did right there is that I broke it down into a couple of key words. I say there was a time in my life in which I used to, and then I filled in two blanks, right? I used to feel alone, or I used to feel empty. And then I say, but then I met Christ and I began to follow him. So those are two things, right? Or I surrender my life to Christ and I began to follow him, or something like that, something along those lines. And then I'll say, and now my life has purpose and value. Or I'll say, and now my life is meaningful and has purpose, or something along those lines that brings about the resolution to what I used to feel like. But I don't end it there. I end it with a question. Do you have a story like that? Because what will happen is that whenever you're sharing the gospel with someone, is that the first thing you want to do is you want to know whether or not they are a Christian, whether or not they even know what you're talking about. And so you want to let them answer that question. If they say yes, awesome. Let me hear like how it is that you have that story. Oh, great. Like, can you share? Like, how did that come about? And if they say no, then you can lead them with this. And it's like, well, here's how I got there. And so for this next section, I want to show you a simple illustration that I've used with a napkin, with a notebook, with just about everything. I'm going to go slowly on this one, okay? This is called the 3 circles gospel presentation.
If you turn on the television or look at your Facebook feed, it's very clear that we live in a broken world. There's a lot of death, a lot of disease and suffering. But we also see traces of beauty, like the beauty of a sunset or the laugh of a child. And that's because God's design was perfect when he made it. There was no death or disease or suffering. But starting with the very first people, we as humans chose to go our own way and leave God's perfect design. And that's called sin. And sin is what led to brokenness in our world and us and sinfulness. Well, we don't like to be in brokenness, this state that we're born in. So we try to get out. So for some, they try to get out on their own by climbing the ladder of success at work or school, thinking that'll get them out. Others try to get out themselves by doing good things or being religious and going to church and helping people. And while those are great things, they don't get us out of brokenness. Some try to drown out the brokenness with drugs and alcohol, or attempts at suicide, or maybe even relationships. And these attempts to get out of brokenness ourselves end up snapping us back in like a bungee cord. But God loved us so much, he didn't want us to stay in brokenness. So he did for us what we could not do for ourselves. He provided the only way out. And that is through his son, Jesus. You see, Jesus came down into our world and allowed himself to be killed on a cross, taking on our sin. And 3 days later, he rose from the dead. And he declared that if anyone would turn from their way and surrender to him and believe that Jesus came and died on the cross and rose from the dead, and would be willing to make him their king or their Lord, that they would be forgiven and made new, and would then be able to experience God's perfect design for their life. Now I want to ask you, which of these two would you say you're in? Are you still in brokenness, or have you repented and believed in Jesus and are now back in his design? Okay, you're in brokenness. Well, which one of these two do you want to be in? Okay, great. Well, is there anything that keeps you from turning from your way and believing in the gospel of Jesus and making him your Lord, your King? Okay, great. You know, when I chose to make this decision, I prayed a simple prayer, very similar to this picture. I just told God that I'm sorry for my sin, that I left your design, and for the ways that I've tried to get out of brokenness on my own. I'm ready to turn from my way and surrender to you. And I believe that this is true. And I want to make you my Lord so I can become new and experience your design for my life. Is that something you'd like to do? And then just pray with them. So this is the Three Circles Gospel presentation.
Usually a lot of people, what they'll do is that they'll end right there. But you don't. You don't end right there. What you're supposed to do is something called short-term discipleship. And the idea of short-term discipleship is you want to ask them a question. Hey, when in the next 24 to 48 hours could we meet? So that you can literally think about what just happened. And because I want to let you know what goes on in life now, like what happens to life. And so you got to let them simmer. You got to let that part go. But you got to make that time happen. You got to let them know, hey, like when can we talk about this again within the next 24 to 48 hours? And within those 24 to 48 hours, you want to talk about things like baptism. You want to talk about why we go to church. You want to talk about all the essentials that a person may have questions about, but more importantly, that they actually, whether or not they have the questions, that we need to answer to them. And then the long-term discipleship part is actually inviting them to your small group and inviting them into the Bible study that your church does, right? Like Peter's what we do a Bible study on Wednesdays, or our Sunday service. That is long-term discipleship. And would you tell them, hey, I want you to come with me so that you can grow with me. But it's important that you do the short-term discipleship first before you just go ahead and say, hey, just come to my church. It's important. And you may be thinking, oh, I don't have all the answers to those questions. I don't possibly have like a clue theologically as to how I can land in those things. And hey, that's okay. The beautiful thing about this is that you don't need to be a theological seminary major or anything for you to actually be able to help someone out in this. The fact is that if you've been baptized, you probably know why you got baptized, and you can answer in a simple way. There's a reason why you go to church. So just answer those reasons and explain to them why it's so important. I always go back to Scripture. I always use Scripture as my main reason as to why I do the things that I do as a follower of Christ. So it's important that you use Scripture. And if you don't know, listen, hey, there's plenty of passages in Scripture. All you got to do is just Google one and, why do we do this? Why do we do that? And if not, hey, I'm here. I'm a pastor of the church. You can ask Dr. Lemma. We're all here ready to serve. So go ahead and practice this. Practice drawing the circles. Practice saying that sentence with someone. Practice asking a person. Just role play, because repetition is what will get you to feel comfortable to be able to have these conversations. And the more you draw it and the more you're able to say there was a time in my life, the more you do those things, the easier it'll get. So go ahead and practice these, and go ahead and give a thumbs up to this video. God bless.